I'm Admiral Reynolds, 38, a U.S. Navy commander who worked her way from Annapolis to the bridge of a destroyer. For years, I covered my father's bills, drove him to VA appointments, and kept his life running. But when he stood at a family dinner, called me a failure, and everyone laughed, I drew a line that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed by someone you showed up for? Share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before we get into it, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if you've had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What happened next might surprise you. I grew up in a house where service stories were currency. My father wore his unit ball cap like a crown, adjusting it precisely before any gathering where other veterans might appear. The living room walls displayed his commendations in matching frames, each certificate positioned at exact intervals. I memorized every name on those plaques by age 10, Murphy, Jackson, Rodriguez, men who'd served alongside him in places whose names rolled off his tongue with practiced reverence. Sunday dinners meant war stories. Dad would lean back in his chair, hands gesturing as he reconstructed firefights and supply runs, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been there. My mother listened with the patient smile of a woman who'd heard these accounts hundreds of times. I absorbed every detail, filing away his descriptions of leadership under pressure, of making decisions when lives hung in the balance. The veterans of foreign wars post became our second home. While other kids spent weekends at soccer games or shopping malls, I helped Dad polish his medals and arrange chairs for monthly meetings. He'd introduce me to his buddies with obvious pride. "This is my daughter." Sharp as a tack, just like her old man. I'd shake hands with men whose calloused palms spoke of decades in uniform, men who nodded approvingly when Dad mentioned my good grades or my plan to attend the Naval Academy. When emergencies arose, I stepped in without hesitation. A late mortgage payment during his unemployment stretch, I covered it quietly, transferring funds and telling him the bank had extended the deadline. New tires for his aging pickup truck when his pension check came up short, I handled the transaction, claiming I'd negotiated a veteran's discount. The dues for his veterans club, the cost of repainting his old medals case, the expense of replacing his worn dress blues for memorial services, I absorbed these costs as naturally as breathing. "It's fine, Dad. I've got it," became my standard response to his financial stress. I'd learned early that money troubles made him irritable, that pride mattered more than practical solutions. So I found ways to help without making it feel like charity. A check presented as a loan he could repay whenever. A gift card explained as a prize I'd won at work. Credit card payments made anonymously, problems solved before they could fester. He accepted my assistance as tradition, the natural order of family obligation. When his truck needed repairs, he'd mention it casually, then wait for me to offer solutions. When his medical bills piled up, he'd complain about the VA's bureaucracy until I volunteered to make calls and navigate the paperwork. The help flowed in one direction, and he received it without fanfare or extended gratitude, just the brief nod of a man acknowledging what was rightfully his. Pride, in our house, flowed one way too, toward his war stories, his ribbons, his brotherhood with other veterans. My academic achievements earned polite acknowledgement. His combat citations commanded the room's attention. When I graduated summa cum laude, he mentioned it briefly to his friends, then spent 20 minutes recounting the medal ceremony where he'd been recognized for valor under fire. The VA appointments became routine. I'd pick him up Tuesday mornings, navigate the parking garage, sit in waiting rooms that smelled of disinfectant and desperation. He'd emerge from consultations with new prescriptions or referral slips, updating me on his various ailments with the matter-of-fact tone of a field report. Back pain from carrying heavy equipment. Hearing loss from artillery fire. Sleep problems that traced back to night watches in hostile territory. I drove him to physical therapy sessions and picked up his medications. I learned the names of his doctors and the specifics of his treatment plans. When he struggled with insurance forms, I translated the medical jargon and helped him appeal denied claims. The VA system was a labyrinth, but I became his guide through its bureaucratic maze. His friends at the VFW post knew me as the reliable daughter who showed up when needed. I'd arrive early to help set up for events, stay late to clean up afterward. They appreciated my efficiency, my willingness to handle the unglamorous logistics that kept their organization running. Ray's got a good kid, they'd tell each other, and my father would accept their praise with the satisfied air of a commanding officer whose unit had performed well. The Veterans Club meetings revealed the social hierarchy that governed my father's world. Rank mattered, even in retirement. Combat experience trumped support roles. Length of service, deployment history, decorations earned, these factors determined seating arrangements and speaking order as surely as if they were still in uniform. I watched him navigate these dynamics with practiced skill, knowing exactly when to defer and when to assert his position in the pecking order. My own career plans fit neatly into his expectations. The Naval Academy represented legitimate military service, a path that would earn his genuine respect rather than the polite interest he showed for my other accomplishments. When I mentioned my application, his reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. "Now that's real service," he said. "That's following in the family tradition." The application process became a shared project. He helped me prepare for the physical fitness tests, timing my runs and counting push-ups with the precision of a drill instructor. His connections proved valuable, letters of recommendation from his VFW buddies who'd served in leadership positions, introductions to local representatives who could provide the necessary congressional nomination. When the acceptance letter arrived, he read it twice before handing it back to me. "Proud of you, kiddo," he said, and I heard genuine emotion in his voice. That evening, he called his friends to share the news, his tone carrying the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. His daughter would be an officer, a real military professional, someone who would understand the weight of command and the burden of responsibility. The months before I left for Annapolis passed quickly. Dad offered advice about military life, sharing lessons learned during his own service. How to maintain equipment. How to lead by example. How to earn respect from enlisted personnel. His guidance carried the authority of experience, and I listened carefully, knowing these insights would serve me well. The night before I left for the academy, he gave me his old compass, a battered brass instrument he'd carried through 2 deployments. "Navigation is everything," he told me. "Know where you're going, know where you've been, and never lose sight of true north." I understood the metaphor wasn't entirely about geography. As I packed my sea bag, checking and rechecking the required items against the official list, I felt the weight of his expectations alongside my own ambitions. This was my chance to earn the kind of respect he'd commanded from his peers, to build a career that would make him genuinely proud rather than merely satisfied. The tradition would continue, and I would be worthy of it. When I commissioned as an ensign, Dad's response was measured but positive. "Good for you," he said, examining my new shoulder boards with the critical eye of someone who understood military insignia. Then he immediately changed the subject to his upcoming reunion plans, describing the hotel arrangements and the scheduled tours of local military sites. The moment felt significant to me, my first step into official military leadership, but it registered as just another milestone in his busy social calendar. My early assignments earned similar treatment. Operations officer aboard a destroyer, then a staff position at Naval Surface Force Pacific. Each role brought new responsibilities and expanded my understanding of how the Navy actually worked beyond the Academy's theoretical framework. When I called to update him on my duties, he'd listen politely, then steer the conversation toward more familiar territory, his friend Martinez's grandson joining the Marines, or the upcoming Memorial Day ceremony at the local cemetery. The first promotion to lieutenant junior grade came with genuine excitement on my part. I'd earned it ahead of schedule, based on strong fitness reports and recommendations from my commanding officers. When I shared the news, Dad's reaction was notably restrained. "Must be politics," he said after a pause. "They hand those out pretty freely now, don't they? Different Navy than when I served." His friends at the VFW echoed this sentiment whenever my career came up in conversation. At backyard barbecues and holiday gatherings, they'd slap my shoulder with good-natured familiarity. "You Navy folks behind desks nowadays," they'd joke, their tone suggesting that real military service happened only in combat zones. Dad would chuckle along with these comments, never correcting the assumption that my work was somehow less demanding or important than their wartime experiences. The pattern became predictable. Each advancement in rank or responsibility got reframed through their generational lens. When I made full lieutenant, it was because they need to fill quotas now. When I earned my surface warfare officer pin after successfully completing the rigorous qualification process, it was dismissed as different standards than we had. My deployments to the Persian Gulf and Western Pacific were acknowledged with brief nods, then quickly overshadowed by stories from Vietnam and Korea. I began to notice how Dad positioned these conversations. In private, when we talked one-on-one, he'd ask detailed questions about my duties and seemed genuinely interested in my responses. He wanted to understand the technology one worked with, the complexity of modern naval operations, the scope of my leadership responsibilities. But in group settings, especially around other veterans, he defaulted to their shared skepticism about the contemporary military. The VFW meetings became exercises in careful navigation. I'd arrive as Dad's guest, introduced simply as his daughter in the Navy. The older members would share their war stories with the assumption that I couldn't possibly relate to their experiences. Combat, they implied, was the only military service that truly mattered. Everything else was support work, necessary but not particularly noteworthy. When they asked about my job, I learned to provide concise answers that didn't invite follow-up questions. Surface warfare operations became ship driving. Personnel management became paperwork. Strategic planning became office work. I adapted my language to their expectations, downplaying the complexity and responsibility involved in my actual duties. Dad seemed comfortable with this dynamic. He'd thank me privately when bills were due, his truck needed new brakes, the roof required repairs, his prescription costs exceeded his budget. These conversations happened in his kitchen, away from any audience that might witness his dependence on his daughter's financial support. I'd write the checks or transfer the funds without ceremony, accepting his gratitude with the understanding that our arrangement would remain between us. But in public, when the room was his stage, he'd let their assumptions stand uncorrected. When his buddy Thompson made jokes about today's military being soft compared to their generation, Dad would laugh along. When someone suggested that modern officers had it easier than the enlisted men of their era, he'd nod in agreement. The same man who asked for my help with VA paperwork would sit quietly while his friends dismissed my career as glorified clerical work. I began to recognize the social dynamics at play. Dad's identity was built around his wartime service, his membership in a brotherhood defined by shared combat experience. Within that group, challenging their collective narrative about military decline would threaten his standing. It was easier to let them believe that real military service had ended with their generation than to defend the legitimacy of my career. The cognitive dissonance became increasingly apparent. He'd call me for advice about dealing with military bureaucracy, trusting my knowledge of how the system worked. He'd ask detailed questions about my ship's capabilities and my crew's performance. In private moments, he clearly understood that I was a competent professional managing significant responsibilities. But those insights never translated into public support or recognition. The financial assistance continued flowing in one direction. Emergency room bills when his back problems flared up. Repairs to his old truck that kept it running for another year. The annual dues for his veterans organization and the American Legion. Christmas gifts for his grandchildren when his pension check couldn't stretch to cover everything he wanted to provide. I handled these expenses quietly, maintaining the fiction that he remained financially independent. The thank you conversations happened in hushed tones, always prefaced by his assurance that the help was temporary. Next month would be better. The VA benefits would increase. His part-time security job would lead to more steady work. I'd nod and agree, knowing that his pride required these explanations even though we both understood the reality of his situation. Looking back, I can see how I enabled the arrangement by accepting its terms. I wanted his approval, his recognition that I'd succeeded in following the military path he'd laid out for me. So I tolerated the public dismissal of my achievements while continuing to provide the private support he needed. The contradiction seemed manageable as long as I could maintain some connection to his world. The family dinner started normally enough. My aunt had organized it to celebrate my cousin's engagement, and the extended family gathered at Dad's favorite restaurant downtown. I'd quietly covered the bill in advance, arranging with the manager to handle payment without any discussion at the table. It was a familiar routine. I took care of the check, Dad maintained his dignity as family patriarch, and everyone enjoyed the meal without awkward moments over who could afford what. The conversation flowed through predictable channels. Work updates from various relatives. Plans for the upcoming wedding. My cousin's fiancé describing his new job in pharmaceutical sales. Dad held court as usual, sharing opinions about everything from local politics to the quality of the restaurant's prime rib. I participated when directly addressed, but mostly observed the familiar family dynamics. After the main course, as we waited for dessert and coffee, Dad stood up with his wine glass. "Got something to say," he announced, tapping his knife against the crystal to get everyone's attention. The table quieted, expecting one of his traditional toasts, something about family traditions or congratulations for the engaged couple. Instead, he gestured toward me with theatrical flourish. "My daughter here," he began, his voice carrying the confident tone he used when addressing his veterans group. "She thinks she's accomplished something in the Navy. Truth is, she's nothing. A failure." He paused for effect, scanning the faces around the table. All that time in uniform, and what does she have to show for it? Desk job. Pushing papers. The laughter started with my Uncle Tom, then spread around the table. Nervous chuckles at first, then genuine amusement as family members caught on to what they interpreted as good-natured ribbing. My aunt covered her mouth, trying to suppress a smile. My cousin's fiancé looked uncomfortable but followed the group's lead. Even my mother, who knew better, managed a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. I felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in my chest, but something else came with it this time, a cold clarity that cut through the social pressure to laugh along. Everyone was looking to Dad for the cue about how to react, and he'd given it clearly. This was entertainment. I was the punchline. "She's nothing," he repeated, seemingly delighted by the response his performance was generating. Absolute failure at everything that matters. More laughter followed, though I noticed my mother had stopped pretending to find it amusing. I didn't perform a scene. No dramatic speeches about respect or military service. No recitation of my actual accomplishments or the real scope of my responsibilities. Instead, I pushed back my chair and stood up calmly. "I'm heading out," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. I reached into my purse and placed my key to his house on the table next to his wine glass. The physical gesture was simple, but everyone understood its significance. I was returning access, ending the arrangement that had given me a reason to visit regularly, to provide the help he needed while absorbing the disrespect he offered. The laughter died immediately. Dad stared at the key as if it were something dangerous. "Don't be so sensitive," he said, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "It was just a joke. You know that. Enjoy your dessert," I told the table, then walked toward the exit without looking back. I could hear the uncomfortable silence I'd left behind, punctuated by someone clearing their throat and Dad's voice saying something about no sense of humor anymore. The drive home gave me time to process what had actually happened. The break wasn't really about the specific words he'd used, though they'd been cruel enough. It was about the moment when he'd looked around that table, seen his audience, and decided to sacrifice my dignity for their amusement. Everyone had looked to him for the cue about how to treat me, and he'd given them permission to laugh at my expense. I'd been participating in my own diminishment for years, accepting private gratitude while tolerating public dismissal. The financial support I provided had enabled him to maintain his position as family patriarch even as his actual resources dwindled. My silence during his friends' jokes had allowed them to believe their assumptions about modern military service. I'd been complicit in creating the conditions that made tonight's performance possible. At home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my deck, looking out at the harbor where my ship was moored. The lights from the base reflected off the dark water, and I could make out the silhouettes of other vessels in the distance. Tomorrow, I'd be back aboard, managing the complex logistics of maintaining a modern warship, supervising the careers of dozens of sailors, making decisions that affected millions of dollars in equipment and resources. The contrast was stark. In uniform, I commanded respect through competence and authority. In civilian clothes at family dinners, I was expected to accept being called a failure for the entertainment of people who had no idea what I actually did for a living. The disconnect wasn't sustainable anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "He didn't mean it like that. You know how he gets." Then another, "Come back. Don't leave like this." I turned off the phone without responding. The key I'd left on the table represented more than access to his house. It symbolized the entire arrangement, my willingness to provide support while accepting his need to diminish my achievements in front of others. Without that key, he'd have to figure out how to handle his emergencies without my help. Without my presence at family gatherings, he'd have to find other sources of entertainment. I finished my wine and went to bed, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years around family events: peace. The decision had been made. The boundary had been established. Now I'd see what happened when the arrangement shifted and the help stopped flowing in only one direction. The next morning, I met my executive officer for coffee at the cafe near the base. Commander Sarah Chen and I had developed a friendship that went beyond our professional relationship, built on mutual respect and the shared experience of being women in Navy leadership positions. She'd noticed I seemed distracted during the previous week's department head meetings, but hadn't pushed for details until I asked if we could talk privately. I recounted the dinner incident without dramatic flourishes, sticking to the facts. Dad's public humiliation disguised as humor. The family's willingness to laugh along. My decision to leave and return his house key. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, but keeping her expression neutral. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me carefully. "Can I ask you something directly?" she said. "Of course. What would you never ask one of your sailors to tolerate?" The question hit harder than I'd expected. I thought about the junior officers and enlisted personnel under my command, the standards I set for how they should be treated by supervisors and peers. The answer was immediate and clear. "Disrespect that undermines their authority," I said. "Especially public humiliation designed to entertain others at their expense." Sarah nodded slowly. "What else?" I continued thinking through my leadership principles. Taking advantage of their generosity while giving nothing back. Using their competence and reliability while dismissing their actual contributions. The parallels were becoming uncomfortably obvious. And if someone in your chain of command was enabling that kind of treatment, making excuses for it or staying silent when it happened, I'd counsel them about setting appropriate boundaries, I admitted. About not accepting treatment that they wouldn't tolerate for their subordinates. We sat quietly for a moment while I absorbed the implications. Sarah had guided me through a mental exercise that revealed what I already knew but hadn't been willing to admit. I'd been tolerating behavior that violated every principle I applied to leadership and professional relationships. "You mentioned financial support," Sarah said carefully. "Can you give me a sense of the scope?" I started listing the assistance I'd provided over the past few years. The mortgage payment during his unemployment. Multiple car repairs and replacements. Medical bills not covered by VA benefits. Veterans organization dues. Holiday gifts for grandchildren. Emergency room visits. Property maintenance. Insurance deductibles. The accumulated total was substantial, easily equivalent to several months of my base pay. As I recited the list, I heard how lopsided the arrangement had become. Money and assistance flowed consistently in one direction, while respect and recognition never seemed to make the return trip. I'd been subsidizing his lifestyle while accepting his need to diminish my achievements for social purposes. "What would you call that dynamic if you saw it in one of your sailors' personal relationships?" Sarah asked. The question forced me to apply the same analytical framework I used when counseling junior personnel about toxic relationships. Financial exploitation combined with emotional manipulation. Public humiliation balanced against private dependency. The pattern was clear once I stopped making excuses for it. "I'd call it unhealthy," I said finally. "And unsustainable." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. "You're a hell of an officer," she said. "You deserve better from family than you'd accept from strangers." The conversation continued for another hour, but the essential insight had already crystallized. I'd been enabling a dynamic that contradicted everything I believed about healthy relationships and professional standards. The financial support wasn't inherently problematic, but accepting disrespect as its price had created a toxic cycle. That afternoon, I sat in my stateroom and made a comprehensive list of the assistance I'd provided over the past 3 years. Credit card payments, emergency cash, repairs and replacements, medical expenses, social obligations. The pattern was consistent. I'd respond to his crises and requests without question, maintaining his dignity and independence while my own achievements got dismissed or diminished. I also listed the instances where he'd undermined or dismissed my career in front of others. The jokes about desk jobs and easy standards. The implications that modern military service was less demanding than his generation's experience. The failure to correct his friends' assumptions about my actual responsibilities and capabilities. The tally was revealing. I'd provided substantial material support while receiving consistent social and emotional diminishment. The relationship had become fundamentally transactional, but the terms were entirely one-sided. My phone showed several missed calls from family members. Mom trying to mediate. My aunt suggesting I was overreacting. A voicemail from Dad himself, his tone suggesting annoyance rather than remorse. "This is ridiculous," his message said. "It was just a joke. Call me back so we can straighten this out." I didn't return the calls. Instead, I spent the evening reviewing my financial records and calculating exactly how much I'd invested in maintaining this dysfunctional relationship. The amount was significant enough to have funded a substantial emergency savings account or covered the down payment on a better apartment. The next day brought clarity about my next steps. I would stop funding the image he wanted to project while continuing to absorb the disrespect he felt entitled to give. The house key had been just the beginning, a symbolic gesture that represented a much larger shift in boundaries and expectations. If he wanted financial assistance, it would come with conditions about respectful treatment. If he wanted me present at family gatherings, he'd need to demonstrate basic courtesy in public as well as private settings. The days of accepting private gratitude while tolerating public humiliation were over. The decision felt both frightening and liberating. I'd been operating under the assumption that family relationships required different standards than professional ones, that blood ties justified accepting treatment I'd never tolerate from colleagues or friends. Sarah's questions had forced me to examine that assumption and find it wanting. I was a naval officer trained to make difficult decisions under pressure. It was time to apply those skills to my personal life and establish boundaries that reflected my actual worth rather than my willingness to be diminished for others' entertainment. 3 days after the dinner incident, I received an email from the Coastal Veterans Reunion Committee that changed everything. The subject line was simple: special guest request, USS Halsey. The message explained that they'd discovered I was the commanding officer of a destroyer that would be making a port visit to San Diego during their reunion weekend. Would I be willing to attend their opening ceremony and perhaps say a few words about modern naval operations? I read the email twice, understanding immediately that this was the same reunion Dad had been planning to attend for months. He'd mentioned it repeatedly, how his old unit was finally organizing a proper gathering, how they'd rented the ballroom at the hotel downtown, how excited he was to reconnect with men he hadn't seen in decades. The committee had found my name in the local newspaper's coverage of our recent return from deployment. Apparently, someone had done their homework and realized that having an active-duty commanding officer at their event would add prestige to the proceedings. They offered to adjust their schedule if necessary and requested a brief biography for their program. I stared at my laptop screen for a long time, considering the implications. This could be pure coincidence, or it could be an opportunity to demonstrate exactly what my supposedly meaningless naval career had actually accomplished. Either way, my answer was immediate and unambiguous. "I'd be honored to attend," I replied. "I'll wear service dress blue and can speak for 10 to 15 minutes about current naval operations and the continuity between past and present naval service." The next email exchange revealed how thoroughly they'd researched my background. The committee chair mentioned my deployment record, my command responsibilities, and my ship's recent achievements in exercises and operational missions. They were clearly impressed by having attracted such a high-ranking guest to their event. I spent the following day preparing my remarks. Nothing about family relationships or personal history, just professional content about the Navy's current mission, the technological evolution of surface warfare, and the unchanging importance of leadership and seamanship. I reviewed my ship's statistics, our crew's accomplishments, and the strategic significance of our recent operations. The evening before the reunion, I made a decision that felt both necessary and overdue. I called Dad's number and got his voicemail. "This is Caitlin," I said, using the formal tone I employed for official communications. "I'll be attending your reunion tomorrow evening as a guest of the organizing committee. I wanted to let you know in advance so it wouldn't be a surprise." Then I added the boundary that had been missing from our relationship for far too long. No more loans. No more jokes at my expense. You want me around, you speak to me with respect. These aren't negotiating points. They're requirements. I ended the call without waiting for a response. If he wanted to discuss my conditions, he could do so after he'd had time to consider what kind of relationship he actually wanted with his daughter. That night, I pressed my service dress blue uniform with particular care. The gold stripes on my sleeves represented years of professional development and increasing responsibility. The ribbon rack told the story of my operational deployments and professional achievements. The command pin marked my current position, leading 300 sailors aboard a sophisticated warship. I'd spent so many years downplaying these symbols to make Dad and his friends comfortable with their assumptions about modern military service. Tomorrow, I would let the uniform speak for itself without apology or self-deprecation. The hotel ballroom was exactly what I'd expected: round tables decorated with small American flags, a podium flanked by service banners, elderly men in ill-fitting suits greeting each other with the enthusiasm of a high school reunion. The organizing committee met me at registration, clearly excited to have attracted such distinguished guests. "Commander Reynolds," the chairman said, shaking my hand with obvious respect. "Thank you so much for joining us. The men are really looking forward to hearing from you." I scanned the room and spotted Dad near the bar, wearing his best suit and already deep in conversation with several other veterans. He hadn't noticed my arrival yet, but I could see him holding court in his familiar style, gesturing animatedly while his companions listened with the respectful attention he commanded in these settings. The moment of truth was approaching. In a few minutes, he would realize that his daughter, the supposed failure whose career he'd publicly dismissed as meaningless, was the evening's featured speaker. The room would discover that the woman he'd humiliated for entertainment was actually the commanding officer of a billion-dollar warship with a crew larger than most small companies. I checked my watch and straightened my jacket. Time to see what happened when his two worlds collided and he could no longer control the narrative about my achievements. The boundary I'd established over the phone was about to be tested in the most public way possible. "Shall we begin the program?" the chairman asked. I nodded and followed him toward the podium, ready to let my actual accomplishments speak louder than his jokes ever had. At exactly 1900 hours, the committee chairman approached the podium and tapped the microphone for attention. The ballroom gradually quieted as conversations died down and the veterans found their seats. Dad was still near the bar, laughing with his friends, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. "Gentlemen, if I could have your attention," the chairman announced. "We have a very special guest with us tonight. Please welcome Commander Caitlin Reynolds, commanding officer of the USS Halsey, who will be speaking to us about the modern Navy's mission and the continuity of service between generations." The applause started immediately, but I watched Dad's face as the words registered. His smile faltered first, then disappeared entirely as he processed what he was hearing. His buddies were clapping enthusiastically, looking around to locate this distinguished guest speaker they'd just learned about. I walked to the podium with the measured pace I used for formal ceremonies, acknowledging the applause with a slight nod. The room fell silent as I adjusted the microphone and surveyed the audience. Every face was turned toward me with respectful attention, including Dad's, though his expression showed confusion rather than pride. "Thank you for having me," I began, my voice carrying the authority that came from years of addressing large groups under official circumstances. "It's an honor to speak to men who understand the weight of command and the responsibility of service." I launched into my prepared remarks about modern naval operations, the technological evolution of surface warfare, and the unchanging importance of leadership principles. The audience was engaged and attentive, asking thoughtful questions about current threats, naval strategy, and the challenges of commanding a modern warship. "The USS Halsey carries a crew of 300 sailors," I explained. "We've completed deployments to the Persian Gulf and Western Pacific, supporting freedom of navigation operations and coalition exercises. Our mission requires the same dedication to duty and attention to detail that characterized naval service in your era." An elderly veteran near the front raised his hand. "Commander, what's the biggest challenge you face as a commanding officer?" "Developing junior leaders who can make sound decisions under pressure," I replied. "The technology has evolved, but the fundamental requirements of leadership remain constant. Whether it's 1970 or 2025, a military leader's job is to accomplish the mission while taking care of their people." The questions continued for 20 minutes. These men understood military service at a level that transcended generational differences. They wanted details about operational challenges, personnel management, and the realities of command responsibility. Their interest was genuine and informed, nothing like the dismissive attitude Dad's VFW friends usually displayed. After my formal presentation ended, individual veterans approached with additional questions and comments. They shared stories from their own service, drawing parallels between their experiences and my descriptions of current operations. The conversation was respectful and substantive, two generations of military professionals comparing notes. I noticed Dad standing alone near our table, no longer surrounded by his usual audience. His friends had migrated toward me, asking about my ship's capabilities and sharing their own sea stories. The social dynamic had shifted dramatically in the space of 30 minutes. "Commander Reynolds," said a weathered man with Master Chief anchors on his jacket lapel. "My grandson is considering the Navy. Any advice for him?" "Same advice I'd give any young person considering military service," I replied. "Understand that it's a profession that demands excellence, integrity, and personal sacrifice. But it also offers opportunities for leadership and meaningful service that you can't find in civilian careers." The Master Chief nodded approvingly. That's what I told him. Good to hear it from someone currently doing the job. He paused, then added, "Your father must be very proud of what you've accomplished." I glanced toward Dad, who was now sitting alone at our table, staring at his drink. "I hope so," I said diplomatically. The evening continued with dinner and more informal conversations. Veterans sought me out to discuss everything from naval history to current geopolitics. They treated me as a peer, someone whose expertise and experience deserved serious consideration. The contrast with Dad's usual presentation of my career was stark and unmistakable. During the meal, I found myself seated at the head table between the reunion chairman and a retired Navy captain who'd served as a destroyer squadron commander. Our conversation covered the complexities of modern naval operations, the evolution of surface warfare tactics, and the challenges of maintaining readiness in an era of budget constraints. "The fundamentals never change," the captain observed. "Good seamanship, strong leadership, attention to detail. Sounds like you've mastered those essentials." I could see Dad from my position at the head table. He was eating quietly, occasionally nodding when someone at his table made a comment, but no longer dominating the conversation as he usually did at these events. His friends kept glancing toward the head table, clearly more interested in discussing naval matters with someone who could provide current, authoritative information. After dinner, the committee chair asked me to pose for photos with various groups of veterans. They wanted documentation of their distinguished guest's visit, something they could include in their reunion newsletter and display at future gatherings. I accommodated these requests with professional courtesy, understanding their desire to commemorate the evening. The formal program concluded with a slideshow of vintage photographs and a moment of silence for deceased shipmates. As the evening wound down, Veterans began saying their goodbyes and making plans to meet for breakfast the next morning. Several invited me to join them, and I accepted graciously. Dad finally approached as I was preparing to leave. His expression was difficult to read, embarrassment mixed with something that might have been respect, or at least recognition. "Didn't know you were speaking tonight," he said quietly. "The committee invited me 3 days ago," I replied. "I mentioned it in my voicemail." He nodded slowly, processing the timeline. 3 days ago was when I'd called to establish my new boundaries. The coincidence wasn't lost on either of us. "They seemed impressed," he added, gesturing toward the departing veterans. "They understand what military leadership actually involves," I said. "Unlike some people." The comment hung between us, direct but not hostile. I wasn't interested in drama or extended confrontation. I demonstrated what my career actually represented, and the room had responded accordingly. The social dynamics had shifted permanently. His friends would remember this evening, remember meeting the commanding officer who'd given them serious answers to serious questions. The next time Dad tried to dismiss my service as meaningless desk work, they'd have their own experience to contradict him. The transformation began immediately. Within a week of the reunion, Dad's phone started ringing with calls from his veteran friends, but the conversations had changed completely. Instead of the usual complaints about doctor's appointments or reminiscences about old deployments, they wanted to discuss naval strategy and current military operations. More specifically, they wanted to talk about me. "Ray, your daughter mentioned the Halsey's deployment schedule," his friend Martinez would say. "When did she say they're heading back to the Pacific?" Or Thompson would call asking about the ship's weapons systems, referring to details from my presentation. Each conversation reinforced the reality that I was a legitimate military professional with expertise they respected. The shift in his social standing was subtle but unmistakable. Dad had built his identity around being the authority on military matters within his circle, the guy who could explain how things really worked based on his combat experience. Now his friends had direct access to someone with current, operational knowledge who outranked him significantly. His position as the group's military expert was no longer secure. At the VFW post, the dynamic changed even more dramatically. The members who'd previously dismissed my career as desk work now asked detailed questions about destroyer operations and fleet deployments. They wanted to understand the technology one worked with, the scope of my operational responsibilities, the complexity of modern naval warfare. Their tone was respectful, curious, and completely different from the condescending jokes they'd made before the reunion. Commander Reynolds, the post commander, approached me during my next visit. "We're organizing our annual scholarship breakfast. Would you consider being our keynote speaker?" The invitation was formal, respectful, and represented a complete reversal from their previous attitude toward my service. Dad listened to these conversations with visible discomfort. The men who'd laughed along with his jokes about my supposedly meaningless career were now treating me as the expert in the room. When someone asked about aircraft carrier operations or missile defense systems, they looked to me for answers, not to him. The committee chair from the reunion called to invite me to their next quarterly meeting. "The men haven't stopped talking about your presentation," he explained. "They'd love to hear more about current naval operations and maybe get a tour of your ship when it's convenient." I accepted these invitations because they represented genuine recognition of my professional achievements. These veterans understood military service at a fundamental level that transcended generational differences. When they asked about my command responsibilities or operational experience, they were seeking information from a peer, not humoring someone's pretensions. Dad's response to this shift was revealing. In private, he'd pump me for information about my upcoming assignments and ship operations, clearly wanting to stay informed so he could participate knowledgeably in conversations with his friends. But he never acknowledged that his previous dismissal of my career had been wrong, never admitted that his desk job characterizations had been unfair. The financial dynamic changed as well, though more gradually. When his truck needed repairs, he mentioned it casually but didn't automatically assume I'd handle the expense. When his Veterans Club dues came due, he found a way to pay them himself rather than asking for my help. The pattern of dependence was shifting, partly because he understood that our relationship now operated under different rules. I maintained my new boundaries consistently. When family gatherings included his veteran friends, I participated as myself, a naval officer with legitimate expertise, rather than playing the diminished role he'd previously assigned me. If someone made dismissive comments about modern military service, I corrected them factually and professionally. The test came at my cousin's wedding reception 2 months later. Dad and I hadn't spoken privately since the reunion, though we'd been polite during necessary family interactions. At the reception, surrounded by the same relatives who'd laughed at his failure joke, he stood up to make a toast. "I want to say something about family," he began, his voice carrying less of the theatrical confidence he displayed at the disastrous dinner. "My daughter serves our country as a naval officer. She commands a destroyer and leads 300 sailors." He paused, looking directly at me. "I'm proud of her service." The words were simple, factual, and completely different from his previous approach. No jokes, no qualifications, no subtle undermining disguised as humor. Just acknowledgement of what I actually did for a living. The family responded with genuine applause, and I nodded my appreciation. It wasn't an apology for his previous behavior, but it was recognition that the old dynamic was finished. He could no longer dismiss my achievements without losing credibility with people whose opinions mattered to him. After the reception, he approached me at the bar. "Good toast," I said neutrally. "Mend it," he replied. "Took me a while to understand what you actually do." "The information was always available," I pointed out. "You just had to decide it was worth knowing." He ordered another beer and stood quietly for a moment. "That reunion changed things," he admitted finally. "It clarified things," I corrected. The facts about my career were the same before and after that evening. We talked for 20 minutes, the longest substantive conversation we'd had in months. He asked about my upcoming change of command, my next assignment, my long-term career plans. The questions were genuine, reflecting actual interest in my professional life rather than social obligation. "Some of the guys want to visit your ship," he mentioned. "If that's something you could arrange." "I'll check the schedule," I promised. Tours are possible during appropriate windows. The conversation felt different, respectful, adult, professional. We were talking as peers rather than father benefactor and grateful daughter. The change wasn't dramatic or emotionally charged, just a practical adjustment to reality. Over the following months, our relationship found a new equilibrium. Dad stopped making dismissive comments about my career and started defending it when others suggested that modern military service was somehow less demanding than previous generations' experience. His friends continued seeking my perspective on military matters, which reinforced his need to treat me with appropriate respect. The financial assistance became occasional rather than routine. Emergency situations still arose, medical bills, major repairs, unexpected expenses, but he approached these conversations differently. Instead of assuming my help, he asked directly and accepted my conditions about timing and repayment. The dynamic was more balanced, less presumptuous. More importantly, the public humiliation stopped completely. Family gatherings became normal social events where I was treated with the same basic courtesy extended to other adults. Dad never again used my career as entertainment for others, never again suggested that my achievements were somehow inferior or meaningless. The change wasn't magical or transformative in dramatic ways. It was practical, behavioral, and sustainable. He'd learned that respecting my professional accomplishments was a requirement for maintaining our relationship, and he'd adjusted his behavior accordingly. The boundary I'd established had been tested, proven enforceable, and accepted. Time passed with the steady rhythm of naval service. Deployment cycles, training exercises, personnel evaluations, equipment maintenance. I kept doing the work that defined my professional life, managing complex operations, developing junior officers, maintaining the combat readiness of a sophisticated warship. The respect I commanded aboard ship had always been based on competence and performance, and that foundation remained solid regardless of family dynamics. Dad's transformation continued in small, observable increments. When his VFW friends organized their scholarship breakfast, He attended as a proud parent rather than trying to be the center of attention. When local television interviewed me about the Navy's role in regional security, he shared the news with obvious satisfaction. The man who'd once dismissed my career as meaningless now introduced me to strangers as my daughter, the ship commander. But the changes weren't universal or absolute. Some days he reverted to his old patterns, making subtle digs about military bureaucracy or suggesting that real service had been tougher in his generation. When this happened, I applied the boundary I'd established: polite but immediate disengagement. "I'm going to head out now," I'd say, and leave without argument or extended explanation. The consistency of this response taught him which behaviors would end our interactions and which would maintain them. It wasn't about demanding effusive praise or constant validation. It was about requiring the same basic respect I expected in any professional or personal relationship. My promotion to full commander brought another test of our evolved dynamic. The ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at the base chapel, with family and friends invited to witness the traditional rituals of military advancement. I sent Dad an invitation, but made clear that attendance was optional, not an obligation. He showed up in his best suit, sat in the front row, and watched as my new shoulder boards were pinned on by the squadron commodore. During the reception afterward, he spoke knowledgeably with other naval officers about destroyer operations and fleet structure. His questions were informed and appropriate, reflecting the research he'd done to understand my actual responsibilities. "Congratulations, Commander," he said afterward, using my rank naturally rather than avoiding it as he'd done in previous years. "The Commodore mentioned your next assignment." "Pentagon." "Strategic Planning Staff," I confirmed. "2-year tour, then probably another sea command." "Good career progression," he observed, and I could tell he'd been talking to his veteran friends about how naval officer advancement actually worked. We went to dinner that evening, just the two of us, something that hadn't happened in years. The conversation covered my career plans, his health challenges, family news, and current events. We talked like adults who respected each other's intelligence and experience. When the check arrived, I reached for it automatically, but he waved me off. "My treat," he said. "Celebration dinner for the new commander." It was a small gesture, but significant. For years, I'd covered restaurant bills as part of the broader pattern of financial support he'd come to expect. His insistence on paying represented recognition that our relationship now operated on different terms. The Pentagon assignment brought physical distance that proved beneficial for our relationship. Regular phone calls replaced the tension of frequent in-person interactions. Without the social pressure of his veteran friend's presence, Dad could acknowledge my professional achievements without threatening his own status within his peer group. When I called to update him on my Pentagon duties, strategic planning for Pacific Fleet operations, his questions were detailed and engaged. He wanted to understand the geopolitical implications of naval positioning, the resource allocation decisions that drove fleet readiness, the interagency coordination required for major military operations. "You're briefing admirals on this stuff?" he asked during one conversation. "Admiral Chin gets a weekly update on our planning scenarios," I confirmed. "Sometimes the CNO sits in when we're discussing major policy implications." "Chief of Naval Operations," he said, demonstrating his familiarity with military hierarchy. "That's serious responsibility." These conversations felt natural and genuine. Dad was engaging with my career based on actual interest rather than social obligation. The respect was earned through competence rather than demanded through family loyalty. My mother provided updates on his activities and health. His back problems had stabilized with proper treatment. He'd started volunteering at the VA hospital, helping other veterans navigate the bureaucracy I'd once helped him understand. His financial situation had improved through careful budgeting and the part-time security job he'd maintained. "He talks about you differently now," Mom told me during a phone call. At the American Legion meeting last week, someone made a joke about modern military being soft. "Your father shut it down immediately. Said they didn't know what they were talking about." The image of Dad defending contemporary military service was almost surreal given our history, but it represented genuine growth rather than temporary behavioral modification. He learned enough about current naval operations to understand their complexity and importance. His respect for my career was now based on knowledge rather than family obligation. When I returned from the Pentagon for my next sea command, Dad attended the change of command ceremony without being asked. He understood by then that these events mattered to me professionally, that his presence represented family support for significant career milestones. Watching him interact with my new crew during the reception afterward, I saw how much our relationship had evolved. He spoke respectfully about my qualifications for command, acknowledged the complexity of modern naval operations, and treated my officers with appropriate courtesy. The man who'd once used my career as entertainment had become someone who genuinely understood its significance. The boundary I'd established hadn't just changed his behavior, it had forced him to learn about what I actually did for a living. That knowledge had generated authentic respect, which proved more durable than the forced politeness that might have resulted from simple intimidation. Our relationship would never be perfect or without occasional friction. Family dynamics carried too much history and too many entrenched patterns for complete transformation. But the fundamental issue had been resolved. He could no longer dismiss my achievements without losing credibility with people whose opinions mattered to him. More importantly, I no longer accepted treatment that contradicted my own professional standards. The boundary had held under pressure, proven enforceable in practice, and created space for a more balanced relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Here's what I keep from those years of establishing and maintaining boundaries. Power is not volume, it's policy. I wrote mine and enforced it consistently, without dramatic confrontations or extended negotiations. The transformation wasn't about changing Dad's fundamental character, it was about making clear which behaviors would maintain our relationship and which would end our interactions. The policy was simple: respectful treatment in exchange for continued family connection. No more public humiliation disguised as humor. No more dismissive comments about my career while accepting financial assistance. No more enabling his need to diminish my achievements for social entertainment. The terms were non-negotiable because I'd finally understood that family relationships shouldn't operate under different standards than professional ones. Justice, when it arrived, wasn't a dramatic speech or emotional confrontation. It was a room full of veterans standing at attention while my father's fork slipped from his hand. It was his friends asking me serious questions about naval operations instead of laughing at his jokes about desk jobs. It was the quiet recognition that respect flows toward competence and authority, regardless of family dynamics or generational assumptions. The change didn't happen overnight or without resistance. Dad tested the boundaries multiple times, reverting to old patterns when he thought he could get away with it. But consistency proved more powerful than confrontation. Each time he crossed the line, I applied the same consequence: immediate, polite disengagement. No lectures about respect or family loyalty, just the practical demonstration that certain behaviors would end our interactions. Over time, he learned to navigate the new rules because maintaining our relationship mattered more than preserving his ability to use me as entertainment. The financial assistance became occasional rather than routine, requested rather than assumed, and offered with genuine gratitude rather than entitled expectation. The public comments about my career shifted from dismissive to defensive, especially when others suggested that modern military service was somehow less demanding than previous generations' experience. The key insight was recognizing that I'd been complicit in creating the conditions that made his disrespectful behavior possible. By accepting private gratitude while tolerating public humiliation, I'd enabled a dynamic that contradicted my own professional standards. The solution wasn't changing his personality, it was refusing to participate in arrangements that required me to accept treatment I wouldn't tolerate from colleagues or friends. Family relationships often carry the assumption that blood ties justify different standards, that we should accept behavior from relatives that we'd never tolerate from others. But that assumption only works when all parties benefit from the relaxed boundaries. When one person consistently diminishes another for social gain while accepting material support, the relationship becomes fundamentally transactional and ultimately unsustainable. The financial aspect was particularly important to address directly. Dad's dependence on my assistance had created a power imbalance that he compensated for by asserting social dominance through public disrespect. By maintaining the fiction that he remained financially independent while I absorbed increasing costs, we'd enabled him to preserve his dignity at the expense of mine. Stopping the financial flow forced him to confront the reality of our relationship. He could no longer accept my help while dismissing my achievements because the help became conditional on respectful treatment. The choice was his: adapt his behavior or lose access to both financial assistance and family connection. The veterans' reunion provided an unexpected catalyst for change, but the fundamental shift would have happened eventually through consistent boundary enforcement. When his social circle discovered that his supposedly failed daughter was actually a respected military professional, he had to choose between maintaining his dismissive narrative and preserving his credibility within the community that mattered most to him. His friends' respect for my military expertise created external pressure that reinforced the internal boundaries I'd established. He could no longer make jokes about my career without contradicting people who'd witnessed my professional competence firsthand. The social cost of disrespecting me had finally exceeded the social benefit he gained from using me as entertainment. The relationship that emerged wasn't perfect, but it was honest and sustainable. We talked as adults who respected each other's intelligence and experience. When he needed help with major expenses or health crises, he asked directly rather than hinting or assuming. When family gatherings included discussions of military service, he contributed knowledgeably rather than dismissively. Most importantly, I stopped enabling behavior that contradicted my own values and professional standards. The woman who demanded excellence from her sailors and respect for their contributions finally applied those same standards to her personal relationships. The boundary wasn't about punishing Dad, it was about protecting my own integrity and creating space for genuine rather than performative family connection. The lesson extends beyond family dynamics to any relationship where one person consistently diminishes another while benefiting from their generosity. Professional situations, friendships, romantic partnerships, the same principles apply. Respect flows toward competence and authority when those qualities are recognized and defended. When they're hidden or minimized for others' comfort, they lose their power to command appropriate treatment. Power is policy, consistently applied and fairly enforced. I learned to write clear boundaries and maintain them without apology or extensive explanation. The people who respected those boundaries earned continued access to my time, energy, and resources. Those who couldn't adapt to respectful treatment found our interactions became increasingly limited and formal. The fork hitting the china wasn't the moment of justice. It was just the most visible symbol of a power shift that had been building through months of consistent boundary enforcement. Real justice was quieter and more sustainable, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation, honest communication rather than hidden resentment, and genuine appreciation rather than entitled expectation. That's what I keep, and what I'd recommend to anyone facing similar dynamics. Identify your standards, communicate them clearly, and enforce them consistently. Family loyalty shouldn't require accepting treatment that contradicts your fundamental values. Respect isn't earned through blood relation, it's maintained through behavior that honors the dignity and accomplishments of all parties involved. The compass Dad gave me before I left for the Naval Academy proved prophetic in ways he probably didn't intend. Navigation is everything. Know where you're going, know where you've been, and never lose sight of true north. My true north was always professional excellence and personal integrity. The boundary work wasn't about changing direction, it was about refusing to let family obligation pull me off course. Here's where I'll leave it. If this resonated, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a nudge to set a boundary. In the comments, tell me, what was the moment you finally drew a line? Who underestimated you, and how did you respond? Have you had a public shift that changed the dynamic? Did you rebuild trust or walk away? On what terms?